All right, welcome to Week 8 Forum. I prefaced some of our discussion this week in the overview, noting the importance of globalization for understanding the increased incentives that terrorist groups have for going international. So, what exactly is globalization, and how has the transformation in international banking and communication created more opportunities for terrorist groups to engage in high-profile events that capture wide, attention? The narrative that Martin used for understanding international terrorism is that violence spills over into the international arena. This chapter focuses on dissident terrorism and the incentives that dissident terrorist groups like the PLO or radical Kurdish or Armenian groups had to publicize their causes internationally. Looking at the chapter perspective 8.1 on page 199, how has the environment for international terrorism evolved from the end of World War II into the 20th century? Um, One of the most important tasks for this week is to differentiate between domestic and international terrorism. As you read Martin's discussion, I think we can differentiate between those acts that are clearly domestic in nature, like the Murrah Federal Building bombing in 1993, from those that are clearly international in nature, like the 9/11 attacks. Are there some hard cases that are perhaps a little bit more difficult to just clearly place in one box or another? I mean, that should help us, if we think about it, figure out what exactly is international in nature and what is unambiguously domestic. Martin concentrates a great deal on the unambiguous cases where international dimensions of events are pretty easy to discern. He notes that attacks on embassies are a good, a good example of these unambiguous cases. And he's got an interesting discussion of the Benghazi attack on September 11th, 2012, in the chapter Perspective 8.2 on pages 204 and 205. What are some of the factors of that particular event that generated so much partisanship and controversy? By the way, I understand if you don't like Hillary Clinton and if you think she was responsible for the deaths of Libyan ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, and the 3 other U.S. personnel. I'm happy to discuss it with the class. I hold no brief for Hillary Clinton, but I believe that as political scientists, we need to take our partisan hats off when we analyze these kinds of situations. I've read a lot on Benghazi. I've read the Benghazi report. I think there were plenty of genuine mistakes made by the Obama administration, but I don't think that they were massively incompetent. I mentioned in the overview that airline hijackings were among the first wave of incidents that unambiguously constituted international terrorist incidents. Why did Palestinian dissidents in the 1960s focus so heavily on hijacking? What did they hope to achieve? And how did governments ultimately respond to those hijackings over time? Martin briefly mentions international establishment or state terrorism, noting that he had previously discussed the use of terrorism as an instrument of foreign policy. In this sense, governments use terrorist groups as proxies to achieve their end. This is the sort of thing that became very common during the Cold War, which again we can talk about. For example, aspects of the Phoenix operation, which was carried out by the United States and Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops, ARVN troops, in many instances, had many of the characteristics of an establishment terrorist campaign. Likewise, the Soviet Union routinely provided arms training and funding to dissident groups in Europe and the developing world, which gave rise to the idea of a Soviet Union or Soviet orchestrated terrorist network. And of course, Martin discusses the idea of a monolithic terrorist conspiracy on pages 213 and 214. I can say in the 1930s, when I was immersed in the issues, I was fairly skeptical that the Soviet Union was that effective as a sponsor of terrorism, that their networking tended to be more opportunistic and was probably a lot more limited than would be admitted by the monolithic terrorist environment theorists of the time, people like Claire Starling and people like that. There was, however, a lot of coordination as the Japanese Red Army's willingness to cooperate with other terrorist groups in the 1970s attests. Martin describes their attack on the Lod airport on May 30th, 1970, which left 26 dead and 80 wounded, as a remarkable example of international terrorism in its purest form. Leftist Japanese terrorists killed Christian pilgrims from Puerto Rico arriving on a U.S. airline at an Israeli airport on behalf of the Nationalist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is the sort of description that causes so many analysts to simply shake their head and conclude that the distinguishing feature of terrorism is its senselessness. Martin spends a good deal of time in the chapter describing the international dimension of the new terrorism. He notes the emergence of the Afghan Arabs, who considered themselves to be mujahideen, or holy warriors. Why did so many Arab men go, travel to Afghanistan to fight? What is the likelihood that that first generation of international Islamist fighters inspired a second generation of fighters, and importantly, sympathizers to the cause of international Islamic fundamentalism? One last issue I want to mention is the chapter Perspective 8.4, Beyond Al-Qaeda, on pages 219 and 220. To me, what is interesting about Al-Qaeda is how distinctive it was compared to, again, previous, Middle Eastern terrorist groups, prominently the Palestinians. Why did Al-Qaeda form as such a distinctive group? How is it able to persist in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq? To what extent was the United States sort of playing into Al-Qaeda's hands in occupying those two countries and engaging in massive military operations in the Middle East? What role does Al-Qaeda play today in international terrorism? All right, so hopefully I've given you plenty to think about and to discuss this week. As always, if something in this week's chapter is confusing to you, or if something in current events is raising an issue that you think the chapter might be in error, or Martin might be in error, ask a question. I may have the answer, or a fellow student may be able to clear things up. All right, let's have a great week.